Let me comment briefly on recent developments in the banking sector. Conditions in that sector have broadly improved since early March, and the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
A few moments later.
Sound and resilient.
PacWest stock ended up falling by over 50% literally just a few hours after Powell said that the banking system was sound and resilient. And the very next day, both PacWestern and Western Alliance stock were down by over 50%. I was able to capitalize on this by buying some puts for Western Alliance, and I got out the same day. And the reason why I got out the same day instead of holding until Western Alliance went to zero is because Congress is proposing a ban on short selling. And that was all just on Thursday. We had a pretty wild week, but we had a very slow start to the week on Monday with the ISM manufacturing PMI coming in at just 47.1 versus 46.8 expected. And this is a slight improvement from March at 46.3. So this means that manufacturing purchasing managers are feeling a little bit more bullish, but this is still a negative reading since it's below 50. So until the manufacturing PMI goes above 50, we're going to continue to see a deterioration in manufacturing, which means that less goods are being manufactured and produced, which means that we're probably going to have continued inflation until demand gets destroyed. And feeding into that inflation narrative, we had manufacturing prices going to 53.2 for the month of April, and this is up from just 39.4 for the month of January. So we're seeing manufacturing prices going up month after month, which means that the higher price of manufacturing goods is going to be passed down to the consumer at the end of the line. So Monday was a pretty boring start, but then on Tuesday, we had the JOLTS job openings at 9.59 million job openings for the month of March versus 9.775 million expected. And this is a downtrend from 9.974 million jobs in February. So about 400,000 less jobs that were available for the month of March versus February. But somehow the ADP non-farm employment and basically every other jobs report keeps coming in better than expected, with the ADP non-farm employment change coming in at 296,000 jobs added for the month of April versus 148,000 expected. So literally 100% beat versus expectations, and this is up from just 142,000 jobs added for the month of March. We had the unemployment rate ticking lower again at 3.4% versus 3.6% expected, and this is down from 3.5% for March. This is the lowest reading that we've seen since 1969. Nice. But what's interesting is we're having this unemployment number coming in lower and lower, but we're having the continuing jobless claims, or the total number of people that are unemployed, going higher and higher, with the continuing jobless claims at 1.805 million versus 1.855 million expected. And this is actually down from last week at 1.843 million. But if we compare this to just a couple of months ago, back in February and March, there are only 1.65 million people unemployed back then, versus over 1.8 million unemployed as of right now. So we saw a 10% uptick for the unemployment and continuing jobless claims, but somehow we're having a record low unemployment percentage at 3.4%. And the data for all this is coming in all sorts of whack, with the non-farm payrolls coming in at 252,000 jobs added versus 180,000 jobs expected. And this is up from 165,000 jobs added for the month of March. But the March reading was revised down from 236,000 to 165,000. And it seems like basically every single month we're having this huge revision for the non-farm payrolls. So this data is just all sorts of whack. But hey, at least the unemployment percent is the lowest that we've ever seen, or at least that's what they're telling us. So those were all the big events that happened for this week, and the earnings that I was watching: AMD, Apple, and Carvana. AMD ended up falling by 1.2% this week after an earnings per share of 60 cents versus 56 cents expected. So they beat on their earnings per share, but this was a 47% decline for year over year. Last year for Q1, they were doing 113 earnings per share. This quarter, they only did 60. And their Q2 guidance for their revenue was $5 billion to $5.6 billion expected, whereas Wall Street wanted them to do $5.5 billion in revenue. So guidance wasn't very good. They ended up declining on the year over year reading for the earnings per share. So not a pretty week for AMD. But Apple and Carvana, on the other hand, had a beautiful week, with Apple going up by 2.4% this week after yet another surprise beat at 152 earnings per share versus 143 expected. And they kept their Q3 guidance the same as they did for Q2. So they didn't neg their guidance. So they didn't make their guidance any worse, and they ended up beating on the earnings, beating on the revenue. So this was a perfect setup for them to go above the $170 resistance level. And then Carvana, the big one of the week, ended up going up by 22.6% this week, after negative 151 earnings per share versus negative 192 expected. And they had the best first quarter adjusted EBITDA, or earnings before income taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But this was still negative at negative 25 million. So best first quarter in history, but they're still losing money. But they're saying that they might be able to turn the company positive on their EBITDA by next quarter. So they had a really good guidance, which ended up sending their stock up by 22.6% this week. So that's your recap for this week. And then for next week, you're going to have the March wholesale inventories at 8:30 in the morning, 0.1% expected versus 0.1% for February. Consumer inflation expectations is coming in at 11 a.m., where last month we saw 4.7% for the month of April. And if this continues to go up, that means that inflation is entrenched into the minds of the consumer, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people think that prices are going to continue to go higher, they're going to buy goods now, get them at a cheaper price, which adds to demand. And if we don't have enough supply to make up for that, prices will continue to go up. Tuesday, we don't have any major events, but Wednesday, we have the CPI number, big event of the week, with the April CPI coming in at 8:30 in the morning at 5.0% expected versus 5.0% for March for the year-over-year reading, and 0.4% expected versus 0.4% for the month-over-month reading. The core CPI is expected to come in at 5.5% versus 5.6% for March for the year-over-year reading, and 0.4% versus 0.1% for the month-over-month reading. And then on Thursday, we're going to have the PPI, or the Producer Price Index, coming in at 8:30 in the morning, 2.5% expected versus 2.7% for the year-over-year reading in the month of March, and then 0.3% expected versus negative 0.5% for the month-over-month reading. The core PPI is expected to come in at 3.3% versus 3.4% for the month of March for the year-over-year reading, and 0.2% expected versus negative 0.1% for the month of March for the month-over-month reading. And then also on Thursday, you're going to have the initial jobless claims at 8:30, where we're expected to see 245,000 job losses for this week versus 242,000 as of last week. And the continuing jobless claims, or the total number of unemployed people, is expected at 1.825 million versus 1.805 million as of last week. And then finally, Friday, the last report we're going to get is going to be the May Michigan Economic Report at 10 in the morning, where the consumer expectations, the expected is 59.8 versus 60.5 for April. So consumer expectations is continue to see a decline. And if consumer expectations continues to slide, that means that the consumer is finally catching on to the idea that we might be going into a recession. Consumer sentiment is expected to come in just barely worse than it was last month at 63 versus 63.5% for the month of April. And the one-year inflation expectations last month was 4.6%. So just like the Monday inflation expectations, if this goes higher, that means that inflation is entrenched into the minds of the consumer, which adds demand pressure, which makes prices go higher even more. And that's all the big events that we've got for this week. Hopefully this video was useful. If it was, show some love, leave a like. Thanks for making it to the end, and thank you to all my patrons and my channel members for their support. And as always, remember to stay positive, stay green. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, guys.